Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits. Yes, I am. Well, thank you for joining us again here this week on Musical Talk, where we're going to have a second conversation with the incredibly talented Alexander S. Bermange, principally about his fantastic 5-star show, I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical. It's a show we've discussed here before on Musical Talk, and indeed last week there was a chance to hear again the interview that Alexander and I conducted in Edinburgh in 2019, when that wonderful show, I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical, was being performed there, and where it garnered all manner of praise and pretty much every star available in the constellation. But as I said last week, the really good news is that this is a show that everyone is shortly going to be able to see, because a new virtual streaming version is going to be made available from the King's Head Theatre website between the 22nd of April and the 12th of May. And so I took this as an opportunity to speak again with Alexander to talk about that fantastic show and his career since the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. And as you'll hear, we spoke about how, with retrospect, it's possible to sum up what a success at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe looks and feels like, and the opportunities that it can afford you. But we'll also be talking about how COVID has affected him and his work, and also the challenges of putting on a show designed for theatre in a virtual form. These are all new areas for musical theatre for the most part. We're all grappling with them. Certainly I barely ever watched a video film of a musical before lockdown, and the same is true in spades for those people who were putting shows on. So it's an absolutely fabulous and fascinating conversation, and I hope you'll get something from it. I certainly enjoyed recording it. And Alexander is so very generous because not only has he given me his time, he's also allowed me to play 2 new clean recordings of songs we've heard previously here on Musical Talk from his wonderful show I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical. So in just a minute we'll get into that fabulous conversation with Alexander, but before that let's hear a song about opening numbers called The Opening Number.
You're poised in your seat?
The build-up's begun.
5 minutes ago, a voice was warning the show would be starting in 1.
Then after about a Malteser or 3, at last the house lights go out, oh so gradually.
A voice goes,
Ladies and gents, blah 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 blah.
there's yet more silent suspense, and then the opening bar.
The overture brings tingles to your skin.
The day's preoccupations are gone.
You're gagging for the action to begin.
Then at last you sense a song coming on.
Oh, what a beautiful tradition. It's how the company of a musical says hello. It will commonly have too much exposition. It's another opening of another show. And you'll love the opening number, the song that can't come too fast. That first song line, the long-awaited sign, the darn thing started at last. Then comes comes a sneaky suspicion, more painful with each word you hear. The show's kicked off with a dart, and it's all downhill from here.
You won't want to miss the dialogue between the verses.
Admire how the length of the underscoring fits perfectly with
You'll
what's
love
being
the opening number, though they'll have skimped on the set. And soon you found the guy who's doing the sound has not quite mastered it yet. And the lyrics flaws all so mean, no way to understand the cast, while those playing Yanks will all sound like they're natives of Belfast.
And meanwhile, half the audience finish off the emails they've begun.
The others start unwrapping all their boiled sweeties one by one.
And looking towards the bit of stage some pillar hasn't blocked from view.
your seat's ideal to watch some giants head that's right in front of you.
Then latecomers come clamoring through, not caring if they take an H.
At least they're a distraction from the total bilge that's on the stage. You'll love the opening number when sets aren't wobbling like hell, or they're designed by someone clearly blind.
There could be miming as well.
You'll wish you'd have checked Wikipedia for synopsis before you had gone, for then you might have a clue what the hell is going on. What's best in the opening number will be the big finish, no doubt. No matter if they deserve it, they'll pause for a few moments applause. So while you're giving them yours, get out.
But don't do that now.
Musical talk. Alexander, can I just say first of all what a real pleasure it is to get an opportunity to speak to you again? Because you were one of the great people I spoke to in 2019, and the opportunity of a second bite of the cherry is really enticing to me.
Oh, well, the pleasure is all mine. Thank you very much for wanting to speak to me again. I recall that interview very, very well. It was actually very early on during Edinburgh, and I think it might have been very early in the morning in a secluded corner of somewhere at the Gilded Balloon, if I remember correctly.
You remember absolutely perfectly. That's right. Yes, we went fairly early to avoid the crowds, when crowds were a thing.
I know. I mean, goodness, hasn't the world changed in the, less than 24 months since then?
Exactly. And, you know, in fact, I think it's because of those changes we're going to have so much to talk about today. But let's start with the Edinburgh Festival Fringe of 2019.
Sure.
I mean, you're right. I saw I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical, which is your fantastic, copper-bottomed, brilliant show.
Oh.
Five stars from Musical Talk, and indeed everyone else on the planet who saw it. Let's be honest.
We were very lucky with our reviews.
No, not lucky at all. That was hard work for you, and it paid off. It really did. But it seems like a lifetime ago, as you've said.
Yes.
Let's start right at the beginning. I saw you, as you say, in the early first third of your full run. You did the full 3 weeks.
Yes.
How did Edinburgh then work out for you? I mean, I know it went well, but how did it seem to you? And how does work respond to that? I mean, obviously, once you're a success, can you take your foot off the accelerator, or do you have to carry on pushing to the very last day of the Fringe?
Oh, well, it depends who you are. If you're me, you carry on pushing until the very last day of the Fringe. I mean, Edinburgh was exhilarating, exhausting, eye-opening, mind-blowing, and so much more. We really didn't know what to expect when we went up there. I mean, obviously, it was a show that had a couple of short runs in London in a rather different setting, presented more in a cabaret environment than in a theatrical environment. And we went up having heard all of the warnings and doom predictors, not for this show in particular, but just for the challenges of the Edinburgh Fringe. Just that, you know, there is so much competition. You need to make an awful lot of noise to be heard above the crowd. You should consider yourselves lucky to have a space that's 50% capacity capacity. We were going to a rather larger venue than, if I'm completely honest with you now, I felt comfortable with. But I think in some ways those played in our favour, because it meant that there was absolutely no complacency whatsoever, and that we did our homework and we'd set up various kinds of avenues for promotion and publicity, and went up there totally seeing that as part of the gig. And I think one of the most magical moments was that the Edinburgh cast and myself still talk about, was that very, very first performance when we weren't really a known entity at all. You know, then it wasn't one of those returning shows that had been going to Edinburgh for 10 or 20 years. And we really were, you know, we wouldn't have been entirely surprised had there been a handful of people there, the midweek previews, and all these people just kept coming in.
Marvellous.
And I think we were just fortunate that there were sufficient people during those preview days that were sufficiently intrigued by the title or the concept, or had caught mention of it on some of the pre-publicity or whatever. But I think because we got off to a flying start for whatever reason, that actually made it a lot easier than what we were all fearing would be the case, which is so often the case with fringe shows, whether in Edinburgh, London or anywhere else. You might have a run of 3 or 4 weeks, and it's only towards the end of the run that sufficient people have seen it to then enable the word of mouth to carry sufficient momentum to ensure decent houses. I think because we got off to that start, it was an incredible advantage. What it did mean, though, just going back to your asking whether it enabled us to take our feet off the accelerator, it did mean that after those first few sold-out performances, anything less than a sold-out house would have seemed like failure. I know that probably sounds awful, but after you've been on the sold-out boards a few times at the beginning of your run, you desperately don't want it to say seats available for any of your subsequent performance. And so that did become somewhat of a challenge. I mean, a challenge which, thankfully, we were delighted to be able to meet, despite, you know, the days that everyone describes as Black Monday and all these other days. The
50 Shades of Grey Sunday, yes, I'm aware of them.
Oh, yeah, all those things. But I think the stars did align. I mean, it was also incredibly hard work. It was incredibly stressful. The show is about all of the things that go on behind the scenes of a show, and never were many of those things truer than in the case of our show in Edinburgh. But I think that they were hardships and struggles that were at least worth it, because we were getting the audiences and we were getting the reviews. But obviously, you know, there are all of the usual challenges that go on with putting on a show at the Edinburgh Fringe, and the term bubble has all kinds of other connotations now, doesn't it? You know, but being in a bubble with a small group of people and suddenly having lots of appetite for publicity and trying to keep everyone happy and trying to keep awake and trying to get enough sleep, yes. You know, just trying to strike lots of happy balances. So it was a fantastic experience, but if I'm truthful, it's an experience that I look back on as being fantastic, rather than one that I was enjoying every single moment of at the time, just because there were so many other concerns and responsibilities and preoccupations that were going through my head.
Do you know, that's a very good and very honest answer, because I think it really does actually sort of display, for anyone who hasn't really experienced Edinburgh, even as a customer, shall we say, just as a punter,
yes,
the reality of the situation. And your show, I think we need to clarify here. I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical is a professional show. It's a fringe show, or it certainly was up there, but it was a professional show with a professional cast, professional crew, and therefore all the things you've described are what you would expect of any show.
Yes.
But there's not normally quite so much tumult that you're fighting against. Whereas some shows at Edinburgh, which are more amateur, have put a lot of thought into their shows and maybe great shows in their own right, but they so often forget about the publicity and the logistics and the continual having to sort of pump prime. So I'm not in any way sort of surprised, if that makes sense, that it's a show that you have retrospectively really enjoyed.
Yes.
But in the moment, to use the modern phrase, you were tending the machinery of show business.
Of course, yes. There was just so many things to focus on and so many things to get right. And, there are far fewer of you working on it. And obviously in Edinburgh, everyone has to muck in rather more than they would in the West End, for example. And so everyone has far more responsibilities and everyone's doing things that they might not normally be doing. But I think what is nice is to largely remember the positive. I suppose it's the same with any experience, the question of taking the rough with the smooth. And there was a lot of smooth, so it was inevitable that there was going to be some rough as well. But, fortunately, nothing that was particularly major or had any kind of effect on any performances that anyone would really have noticed very much.
Do you know, that takes me on to the point you made in your opening sort of conversation, and it's something which I stupidly hadn't ever stopped to think about. Your show, as you've described elsewhere, is a wonderful, if you like, sort of journey through a figurative career, not of one person, but of anyone in show business, from their earliest days at acting school all the way through to, I think, as you say, difficult diva or possibly clapped out has-been.
Yes.
So, it's got all the stages of careers in it, plus lots of loving but knowing statements and observations. But of course, when you've got a professional show with a cast of 4, all of whom are also at different stages because they are to play all those different stages in the show, there is the art within art, isn't there? You've said yourself that you were running a show and it was a show about running a show or putting on a show or being in a show.
Oh, yes.
So I'm not asking you to lift the lid on any salacious rumours because I'm sure there are absolutely none. But you did sort of mention that, you were life reflected art. Was that sort of acknowledged by you and your colleagues, ironically, that people saying, oh, this is the kind of thing that we should put in the show? Or were there any situations you thought, oh, hang on a minute, I've written a song about this a year ago?
There were things that, in fairness, I probably only acknowledged in retrospect. And that now, when I look back on it, I thought, oh, well, isn't it ironic that that was specifically referenced in the show, or there was a song about that in the show, and that became a bit of issue is too strong a word, but
a real thing.
That was a real thing. But I think it was kind of inevitable that was going to happen, because the show, for all of its heightenedness and all of its lightness of touch and comedicness of tone, it is rooted in reality, and that all of these songs that are about everything from auditioning to doing an exhausting dance routine to understudying to onstage kisses to being or working with a diva, they were all songs that I researched, for want of a less pretentious word, by consulting with many of my performer friends. And so the lyrics are very much exaggerated versions of what many of my performer colleagues have experienced in real life. Obviously, it's an accumulation of all of those experiences. So, there's no one performer who would have experienced all these challenges and complications. But I think because of that, it was kind of inevitable that life was going to reflect art in some respect, because this show is very much a compilation of what genuinely goes on in musical theatre performers' lives, without being a glamorization of that journey at all that tries to see it through rose-tinted spectacles. It shows the career of a performer, warts and all.
As the writer-songwriter, did you get a sort of sense of validation from then sort of living the truth of the songs you'd already written about?
Sometimes I do think, oh wow, it's, isn't it ironic? It kind of doesn't always make it easier to deal with. I also should say that I suppose because of my lack of specificity in some of these answers, I don't want to give anyone the impression that what happened in Edinburgh was anything other than what that would go on in any show.
Oh no, of course.
I mean, I'm probably making it sound as though it was a bit like, the final act of Noises Off, when everyone is, at each other's throats. And it wasn't remotely like this. We did have a truly lovely time. But it's just, those things that always happen in the course of any run of any show. You know, you might get someone who one night is a bit prickly or something like that, but it's just like, you know, any job, as the show is at pains to point out. Musical theatre is not all about wide smiles on stage that continue as soon as you you get off stage. I think that, you know, there's also the funny side of it, and I think, ironically, it helps make the performance more truthful, if that makes sense.
Yes.
It means that you can, you know, bring some of the, you know, real life experience that you're going through to bear on the stage, because, you know, ultimately no one's a robot, everyone's human, and, you know, everyone involved in a show, that, you know, that is the wonder of theatre. It's not like going to see a film where everything's already done, and you know, people, you know, your actors' feelings or emotions or what's happened to them that day have no effect on what you're seeing, because everything's already in the can. But for a show, you're dealing with real life humans, so I think it's all part and parcel of the theatrical experience.
And of course, Edinburgh is really tiring, and you did every single day of the sort of the 3 and a bit week.
We did.
And of course, I've got to ask you, did you all avoid Edinburgh flu, which is the show business term for, you know, if you've been up there for 2 weeks, you've been not getting enough sleep, you've been out in rain, probably, because I love Scotland, but, you know, it is moist, even in the summer. You know, you're putting on a show every day. It's a lot of hard work, and it's very easy to get run down and get a cold. And
Yes.
so many people lose their voice about 2 weeks in, you know, and that's
Yes.
another thing that makes the humanity of a show, because it's not a set of machines, it's a set of people from the stage and off the stage, you know, even as far as the audience. But, you know, everyone involved in theatre, it's collaborative effort. You only need 1 or 2 people to get a bit ill, and suddenly you're having to
Yes.
compensate. You avoided, I hope, or at least coped with.
Well, the truthful and diplomatic answer to that question is that, sadly, we didn't all avoid the dreaded Edinburgh flu. The positive was that the show carried on as usual. No one would have noticed, and some of our best 5-star reviews actually were of performances where that was the case. And I think really that is entirely credit to cast members really rallying around and us all coming up with a solution which camouflaged the issue as much as possible, because Edinburgh, by and large, you don't have understudies.
No.
You have to get on with it. But we were blessed with performers who were able to just ensure that their strengths were being played for, and no audience member would have been any the wiser. But no, that was, you know, one of the stresses which kind of plagued several performances, but one which thankfully we were able to deal with, although not without some imagination and hard work.
Do you know, it's very interesting as well, isn't it? Because you quite rightly said at the beginning that your venue was a fairly sizable one in Edinburgh terms. And we're not talking thousands, but we're also... But
no, 120.
yeah, exactly. We're not talking 30. That's a goodish size,
Yeah.
and to fill it is amazing. But it's still small enough to allow you to have an intimate review, which is actually still what it was. And sometimes that sense of camaraderie and collaboration on stage, when you've got 4 actors as you have, plus a rather excellent pianist, I should say, Alexander.
Oh, bless your heart.
Working so very closely and well. And as you say, sometimes working together in order to sort of patch a gap that's occurred for that performance or whatever it is, you know, through to a sore throat or whatever
Yes.
it can be. That sense in an intimate review, in a good, positive intimate review, can roll into the audience, and the audience also sort of become part of it. And it's interesting that you said that actually on some of the evenings that might have appeared stickier for you as the writer, actually turned out to be particularly good. And sometimes I say I've had that experience myself in other shows. I remember one show, I'm not going to name it. It was a great show, but it was marred on the night I went by significant microphone failure. Fortunately, the performers in it were able to improvise. It was a comedy show, so
Yes.
it was a musical actually, but there was an element of improvisation in it, so they were able to sort of compromise and improvise around it. And we, the audience, knew this was happening because we'd picked it up, and we were sort of got behind them. And so the atmosphere was exponentially greater than it might already have been. And I suspect that can pay off in lots of different environments.
I think you're absolutely right. And funnily enough, sometimes it does really focus the mind when you have got to do something different, when you have got to adapt and adjust to a situation whereby you've got a cast member who's a bit under the weather or something like that. And it does bring a degree of freshness to it. And I think the thing about Edinburgh crowds, because I think, microphone failure is not a unique situation to any show, be it, one that's in the tiniest venue that requires amplification to one that's got the biggest budget in the largest possible venue, because everyone's fighting for radio mic frequencies. And I think that the thing about Edinburgh is the Edinburgh audience knows that these things can happen. They know that by and large shows have got virtually next to no time to get in and to get out. And I think they accept that. I think that they also expect to see something of quality, but it's not as though they are expecting to see, something which has, say, got a set that looks as though it's taken 2 months to assemble.
No crashing chandelier is necessary.
Indeed, but I think you have therefore got to compensate in other ways by giving the audience an experience which they wouldn't get in a show where there's a crashing chandelier, to create an environment in which the audience almost feel as though you're having a conversation with them, especially in a show like I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical, when it doesn't have a conventional narrative, and the premise is very much the idea of a group of musical theatre performers sharing their real life experiences with an audience. And I think as long as you build up that rapport with them, you can actually get around a lot of other potential drawbacks that end up not being drawbacks because of the kind of show that you're doing.
Moving on from that then, because we've been talking about the experiences of Edinburgh, and of course your show is all about the experiences of show business.
Yes.
And Edinburgh is just one slice of show business. I'm going to ask you what must seem like a terribly obvious question, but forgive me, I'm going to go straight ahead anyway.
That's all good.
Which is, were there any experiences from your Edinburgh Fringe time that you thought, I better write that down in a notebook because I think there might be a further song in that?
In actual fact, yes.
I'm glad I asked.
There was a song. I mean, in any case, the Edinburgh incarnation of I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical was one that was reduced in length to make it more palatable for Edinburgh audiences. So it was pretty much exactly 1 hour. And the experience did give me the idea for another song to put in it, which in fact has gone into the version of the show that's currently running in Seoul.
Oh, has it?
Yes. So it's never been publicly performed in English, but because South Korea seems to be the one place on earth where theatres seem to have been able to continue virtually uninterrupted to house performances, it's gone into that version, and I'm very much hoping that it will go into future versions of the show over here. So yes, the Edinburgh experience did actually show me there was an angle to being a musical theatre performer that was worth exploring as much as the existing ones that we'd got in the show.
Oh, you've whetted my appetite. I was going to come back and see it in all its various future iterations. I might not go to South Korea. I'm not sure I can do that, but
no. And of course, if your Korean is not that good, you might not you might not understand what the song is about anyway. But hopefully, when theatre returns in this country, hopefully you'll have a chance.
I hope so. And we'll be talking about opportunity to see I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical as we go on, because there are, and that's really excited me in these terribly dull theatre-free times. And I'm looking forward to talking about that in a little bit of time. But
lovely.
Let's sort of move on from the Edinburgh Fringe of 2019. Let's take us to September. So I imagine you're waking up in your own bed after a month away.
Yes.
You're, and when I say that, I mean eventually, because it is so tiring. So it's halfway through September, you re-emerge into the real world. Where did you find yourself with that? The show's been a massive success. It's been a success in the sense of selling out every night. Also in the sense of the reviews have all been really positive. You know, it really couldn't have gone better in so many ways.
Sure.
You're back to looking at the real world in September when theatre was still a healthy option and we had no concept of the things that were to come.
Yes.
Where did you find yourself? Did you think I want to put the show away for a little bit and concentrate on other things, or am I, or is it that it's given me a real bounce? We've seen how successful it generally is. Where do we take this now? Where were you, sort of in your mindset?
I was in both of those spaces. I'm someone who always has to be writing.
Yeah.
So at any one time, I do have multiple projects on the go. And so I was, you know, in September, I would have been furiously writing away at a couple of the other shows that I had on the go at the time. I seem to recall that it was fairly soon after the return from Edinburgh. I think it was only a matter of weeks that we actually did a reading of a new musical of mine that I'd been developing.
Oh.
And so things were busily happening on that front. At the same time, I was absolutely exploring the opportunities that had presented themselves post-Edinburgh. Happily, Edinburgh had generated a huge amount of interest. And so I was having an awful lot of conversations and an awful lot of meetings with an awful lot of people. And in one or two cases with a lot of awful people
I thank you.
about what might what might happen to the show next. And a lot of those were very exciting, and things had progressed fairly far down the line. The one mistake that was made with doing the show in Edinburgh, for all the wonderful things that we've said about the experience and the reviews and the response and the sold out houses, was the year in which we did it. In that, you know, we did it in the year which spawned lots of conversations, lots of interest, lots of plans. And then as of this spring,
Yes.
just as many of those plans were starting to come to fruition, absolutely everything evaporated slowly but surely. Well, not absolutely everything. I'll come on to that in a minute. Fortunately, in a weird way, when things did come rather dramatically to a halt,
Yes.
I was already kind of prepared for it, because there was a production of I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical that was due to happen in Switzerland fairly swiftly on the heels of Edinburgh. In actual fact, it was due to be, I think, round about the beginning of last year.
Oh, right.
And the coronavirus pandemic really gained a foothold there quite some time before the UK.
Did it now? That's interesting.
Yes, and funnily enough, I still remember getting an email, because I was getting all these updates and seeing all the pre-publicity, and there, unlike Korea, it was being done in English, although like Korea, it was a non-replica production, so it was a bespoke Swiss production. But we did get, my agent and I did get an email from the producer before coronavirus was really a buzzword over here, saying, you know, things are going really well. Just to keep you posted, though, we are a number of weeks or months, I can't remember now, ahead of the UK as far as the pandemic is concerned, so things are starting to look a little bit uncertain. And I remember that really stopped me in my tracks.
Yes.
Not so much because of, you know, the prospect of the show being postponed, although obviously that was in my mind, but the phrase being, we are a number of weeks ahead of the UK. And I think at that point in time, I, perhaps like many others in this country, was under the impression that maybe this was something that, for whatever reason, we'd avoid. I mean, we'd all seen those awful pictures on the news from Italy.
Yes.
And I remember thinking, wow, lockdown? That, you know, we're really lucky not to be part of that. And even, you know, I do remember one of the team behind the planned Edinburgh return of I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical in 2020, saying to me when the pandemic did start to gain a foothold here, I remember, you know, saying to me, you know what, I reckon it will be over by May.
Goodness.
And so I think, but because it all happened quite gradually, I think it wasn't as devastating as it might otherwise have been. I think the other thing to say is that once the full impact of it did become clear, even to call it devastating would have been to overstate it somewhat, because we've got to remember how many people died, how many people lost loved ones, how many people went through absolute hell.
Quite.
Ultimately, people who do musical theatre, obviously it is their craft. What has happened to the industry over the course of the last over 12 months now has been nothing short of a tragedy. But ultimately, we are doing shows here. We're not doing life support. We're not burying people. I think, you know, we do need to get things in perspective. That's not to say, you know, people don't have a right to be disappointed and to complain and to ask questions. We absolutely do. And there are a hell of a lot of unanswered questions about how the pandemic has been handled and how the industry has been treated. But I think at the same time, we do need to recognise that in the overall scheme of things, there are things that matter more in people's lives and to humanity at large than being able to put on a show.
I couldn't agree more. It's all important, but, you know, the life and death personal tragedies of people's own experiences are going to be, in the scheme of things, more important than in any profession. Gosh, yes, you're right. It's interesting to me that you sort of, you know, that your Swiss production, if you like, was a bellwether situation for you, which sort of gave you a sense of what was happening, because you're right, it crept into Britain, and there was that sense of perhaps this will be contained elsewhere in the world. And then, of course, exponentially,
yes,
it all went terribly badly, and the 23rd of March 2020 will live in a lot of memories for a very long time as the beginning of a very difficult year plus, which we're not out of yet, although certainly in the United Kingdom the trend is at least positive at the moment, but we must remember that globally that's not the case. So it's not even, you know, we have to remember this is a global pandemic and not even just, you know, we look at it from a British perspective because we're in Britain, but the world suffers terribly. I mean, that raises the question there, however the pandemic crept into the world, whether one saw it coming or one didn't see it coming. You're quite right, however, the people in the theatrical profession particularly are, for the most parts, freelancers or self-employing. Everyone knows show business in all its forms is a precarious way of life. As a writer, as a producer, as a creator, you know, you find yourself in lockdown. Do you say to yourself, are there ways to make things happen? Or do you say that actually what this is really unexpectedly an opportunity to sit down and do more writing because writing is your passion? Or is it going to be, as I suspect with you, Alexander, that wonderful thing of harnessing both horses? Because I know that you're a man who, you're very good at harnessing all the energy, even if it points in different directions.
Yeah, you're absolutely there. Absolutely right. Yes, I mean, I did do both things in that I did veer towards taking my projects in development in directions that they weren't necessarily going to be going in, if that makes sense. So, for example, with the other show of mine that was in development that hadn't yet had a reading, and that was due to have a reading, I think, in March, round about mid-March, early March, we actually ended up doing a Zoom reading. Now, nowadays, you know, given what's happened during the course of the last year, that was, you know, that would kind of be the norm now. But at the time, that was, and we had about a dozen or so great West End artists, for many of whom it was their very first experience of using Zoom. And in actual fact, it was only my, I think, second or third. And in fact, I still get emails from some of them saying, "Oh, crumbs, isn't it funny to think that back then Zoom was a novelty, or that was my first Zoom experience, and now it's quite the norm." So that then was able to have a Zoom reading, and then subsequently that same piece had a workshop within a drama school environment at the Musical Theatre Academy in London, where obviously all the safety procedures and guidelines were being rigorously followed, but that was an environment in which it was possible to workshop a show, unlike in many other environments where it wouldn't have been possible, just because educational establishments like drama schools were able to carry on uninterrupted virtually. Sorry, when I say virtually, I mean practically rather than on screen. Although there was an element of that as well for many drama schools, certainly during the darkest days of the pandemic. But also at the same time, I did think, because the two shows I've referenced were ones which were and kind of are, I suppose, what I would call workshop ready, in that although we have been tinkering away at them, we've kind of been slightly hampered by the extent to which we could really put the accelerator on by everything that's going on in the world. So I did something which I wasn't remotely planning to do, and I actually thought, okay, it's going to be a different. Well, back then it seemed like it'd be a different few months. It's been a different year, but also a year in which, albeit for less than desirable reasons, I have had a heap of time freed up, a lot of time that would have been spent largely travelling to places.
Of course, yes.
Because a lot of my life that's not spent writing would be travelling to production meetings or rehearsals or anywhere, all the other things that we might do in our day-to-day lives, all kinds of other appointments, which in the last year or so it's become the norm to do virtually. That frees up a heap of time, and I didn't want to just use that time in front of the television. and so alongside various other hoped for positive steps in my life, like getting a bit more exercise, doing a bit more cooking, I actually set out to write a completely new show from scratch, which is now practically complete, or as complete as any musical can be, because musicals are always rewritten. So I've got a first draft of something that wasn't there a year ago, and that wouldn't have been there were it not for me thinking, oh, how can I best occupy myself with the time? But also there is always the other side of me, to go back to your original question, which does have an eye on ways to further exploit, for want of a less commercial term, the existing works that I've got. And I think because I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical had created, fortunately, such a buzz in Edinburgh, although the Korean production was able to proceed as planned, I didn't want to just let it gather dust, which is really one of the reasons why, for certainly the first few months of the pandemic, as soon as we started to see this great surge in online productions, in shows that were being streamed, it always occurred to me that it was a show that would be eminently streamable, and so that was something I was throughout this time keeping my eye on the opportunity of. And I think ultimately there are so many different ways and means of doing a streamed show, and fortunately we were able to identify the way of doing it that seemed the best way in to serve the interests of the piece and those involved.
I mean, first of all, that was fabulously interesting. And I think also a real insight into who you are, Alexander, as well as a person, as well as a creator, and how those two things are absolutely enmeshed together. But I love the fact that you're constantly pushing at all the walls to take them further in all directions. And when a situation occurs where a wall turns up that you weren't expecting, you're still sort of fingering your way through the mortar to find a gap, if you like.
Yes, that's a very good analogy, yes.
So, but it also brings us very perfectly to, if you like, the latest iteration of I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical, and this is the thing that excites me so much. Well, I'm excited for two fronts.
Right.
The first is it's an opportunity for me to see it again.
Oh.
And I can't tell you how really excited I am, because it was a show that for me, my favourite shows in Edinburgh, and sometimes they don't become apparent till after Edinburgh, are what I call the take-home shows. Oh. The shows that you find yourself thinking about a week later, a month later, a year later. And I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical is one of those.
Oh, thank you.
So on a very personal level, I'm genuinely excited that I'm going to have a chance to see it again. It's a new production with new people, but the show it's a cracker of a show, and this is a chance to see that cracker again. But I'm also excited that this is an opportunity for listeners of Musical Talk to see it again, because there are people all over the world who are desperate for theatre anyway.
Yes.
But in terms of a show almost perfectly tailored for listeners of Musical Talk, I think I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical is one of them. And the fact that it's going to become available to see online from the 22nd of April until the 12th of May, I think it is.
That's correct.
And we'll be talking about how to do that, how people can see it a little later in the programme. But that's a really great thing. It's genuinely great as a service, let alone as something to look forward to. It's great for the performers. It's great for us as audiences. It's great for the venue. Hopefully it's great for you, Alexander. But in this excitement, there are some questions. You quite rightly said that there are lots of different ways of presenting a show virtually, and this year has been a learning curve, I think, for everyone, both punter and producer, if you like. Both sides of what we must call now the screen rather than the stage. But there are ways of doing it. When we first went into lockdown in Britain, as a fundraiser, the then recently curtailed West End and National Tour of Curtains, for example, broadcast, as I say, I think twice on a fundraising basis, a straight film of what they had done on stage, if you like, as a live performance.
Yes.
And that's been the process on Broadway HD as well, which is a fairly well-known sort of streaming musical theatre and other theatre website.
Yes.
But there are other ways of doing it. Peter Duncan did what I'm going to have to call a hodgepodge pantomime in his back garden with professional actors, filmed last summer for Last Christmas.
Yes.
It worked very well, but of course audience-free in that case. How do you focus a virtual performance? So I suppose my question is, you were looking to do that and it's come to fruition. But there were so many questions to take us to the method and the option that you've gone for.
Yes.
Do you mind just briefly at least explaining why you've gone for what you have and why that seems best?
Quite simply, the King's Head Theatre representatives from the theatre had seen the show in Edinburgh and had expressed a lot of enthusiasm for it. They approached us some weeks ago and explained that they were looking to go into the digital line of presentation of shows, and they explained how they were looking to do them, and it was a question of doing it without an audience, because obviously it's been during this period where theatre hasn't been able to take place with an audience, but performed as live, as though it were a single performance, with not with something that you could then go back and endlessly touch up and edit, keeping that live element of it. And it seemed like a really nice opportunity. I think also for me, although in some respects relinquishing some of the control is terrifying, it means that I can then just focus on the things that I'm meant to be doing, like the writing principally, and any tweaks or changes that we wanted to make, because ultimately this show then does become more like a film, and so it's kind of the director's baby, and it's the editor's baby, and it's the sound mixer's baby, and actually you've kind of bestowed it on many other people who, in fairness, are far more skilled at their respective areas than you would be. I'm not a director, I'm not a sound mixer, I'm not an editor, and I'm not a cameraman. And I think because the King's Head came with a lot of the technical infrastructure in place and the space, and it seemed thoroughly apt to be actually doing it in a theatre, because the show is about theatre. Obviously, it was an interesting experience because a show that is largely comedic, it was strange doing it for the first time with absolutely no laughs coming back from an audience, with no audience reaction. And so that was strange, but it was a wonderful opportunity. I think the thing is, unlike a lot of the shows which we've seen being streamed, particularly in the first part of the pandemic, it's not something that was already in the can.
Yes, good point.
So it was not something that had already been done with loads of cameras, and something that was destined for DVD, Blu-ray and download anyway, that the producers have since generously enabled to make available on like the Shows Must Go On channel or things like that. Although we'd had videos made of the past incarnations of the show, they were really more archival than anything that would be for broadcast. And I think the other thing that I was quite glad was not my problem, but kind of other people's problem, was just doing it in such a way that we've got to be upfront about this. Means that the economics add up, because obviously I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical is very suited to to relatively intimate spaces, but if you're doing the figures, you've still got to work out a way of doing it that kind of is simultaneously artistically true to what it needs to be, but also makes financial sense, because there is now a lot of competition out there. There are lots of productions that are being streamed, and there's a lot that people can access for free on on YouTube, albeit largely fairly dodgily filmed things that some people don't want to see on YouTube anyway. So there are all kinds of challenges, and needless to say, the other challenge was just rehearsing it and doing it given the restrictions and the limitations that we obviously had, in that although we had half of our cast returning from Edinburgh, and as far as our male cast members are concerned, one of them had done one of the original incarnations in London, but one of them was completely new to the show, and it's a question of making sure that you can rehearse it and then do it in as good as one performance, in such a way as good as possibly can be, bearing in mind the fact that both the health issues and restrictions, and also let's face it, budgetary necessity, has dictated that actually you don't have the luxury of as long a rehearsal period that you would normally. You've got to do lots of things remotely. You've got to send lots of recordings over and videos over of tunes being note bashed on a piano, or of dance routines being shown in people's living rooms, and it does make it a challenge. I'd be lying if I said it didn't, particularly because then you have got to get together for the rehearsals that you do have in person, and for that one time where you all have to do the show, and you're all doing it having not really done it that many times before. It was a challenge, and it's just a product of the times that we live in. Having said that, I've every confidence that the people who I'm trusting to really deliver the goods as far as the post-production is concerned will deliver the goods. It's another one of those things that goes back to the element of how hands-on one can be in such a production. In Edinburgh, where there are far fewer people involved, after a show, you can simply say to a cast member, actually, do you want to just pull back on that line a bit? You're a bit loud, or you can make all kinds of tweaks. With a film, you're actually far removed from that, and things like that get very complicated, especially when there are limitations on time and restrictions on the extent to which you can sit side by side with people in post-production, because there are multiple people doing it in their respective homes or home offices or home studios in isolation. So that's been quite hard, but fortunately that kind of hasn't been my problem, because I guess I am the mere writer, shall we say, a part of an enterprise which has got a far smaller list of people involved in terms of crew than your typical Hollywood epic, but still considerably more than your average theatre production of this size and scale.
You make a point which I think cannot be overemphasised, really, to be brutal, which is that this last year has made us all collaborate in totally different ways. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about theatre or an office job. In my real life, I collaborate now through my screens in my living room for the most part.
Yes.
And so do thousands and millions of people across the world. And, we've taken that and we've adapted, and actually well done, everybody, because we've all had to, and we've done it mostly successfully. But whilst it's a form of collaboration, and we throw that word around, I've used it several times today already in this conversation, and it's understood that theatre, more than any, almost any more profession, is so collaborative, and so many people involved in that collaboration. But actually, it's all that collaboration in a theatre, and I use in a theatre advisedly, as in a particular venue, is a platform. Everyone's there together.
Yes.
Whereas the virtual world we're in, we're still collaborating, but we're collaborating with distance. And that's often forgotten.
Yes.
But distance has been built into our collaboration processes. And of course, collaboration doesn't, at least intellectually, work as well with a distance built in. It seems a contrary concept. And yet we've had to harness pointing in both directions.
Indeed. And I think the thing about working in theatre, there's a wonderful phrase which a lot of theatre people use, which is about being in a room. And it's very much what it says on the tin. It's occupying the same space as someone, because it's there that you can brainstorm, you can spar ideas off each other, you can block things without any restrictions whatsoever. And I think nothing can ever come close to it. I think being in a room with fellow creatives or with talent is irreplaceable. And I think although digital environments can come close, they can't ever hope to match what can be achieved by being in the same room. For example, the very issue of mixing the sound, something like that, it's normally hugely important to have a group of people, your director, your composer, your sound editor, all these people hearing something on the same speakers next to each other, rather than waiting for files to be transferred between them, and ultimately things taking much longer at a time when obviously time is money, and there are only so many edits and iterations that you can go through, and so things like that, it comes back to to the necessity to relinquish control in the ultimately with a lot of digital presentations, it's it's no longer the creatives who have the final say in the sound or the look, but it's the technical people, because that's their job, and if they're any good, they will make the right decisions and it will sound marvelous. But the times in which we're living don't allow for the closeness of collaboration that, you know, literally a group of people occupying the same space, sitting right next to each other, listening to everything through the same speakers from exactly the same position would be able to afford us. But that's just one of the inevitable consequences of the of the strange times in which we're living at the moment.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, I mean, once again, it's all about relationships, isn't it? Because in any theatrical environment, the people who speech marks own it, certainly from the point of view of the public, are the people on the stage. And I have to say, to a slightly lesser degree, the tech crew, the orchestra, whoever. But, you know, it's the people we see are the ones we think of first. But we understand we are entering into the domain of the people of theatre, on stage or otherwise. But of course, via a recording of whatever nature, whether it's a feature film or like this, a specifically recorded theatrical production for broadcast, there is an extra layer, but that layer is a distancing thing. So you, the people in theatre, shall we say, are having to enter the house of someone else in this case, not physically, but it is it's the world of theatrical recording. And actually, you hear about this in any interview about anything. I mean, in my other life, I'm a Doctor Who fan, and so I've read thousands of documents about and articles about how television programs are recorded, and so often, particularly in the past where there was a little bit more time in the system, on television you read about people doing the Times crossword whilst they're waiting for the cameramen to set up a shot. Suddenly the actors are not in their own world, which is theatre, but in somebody else's world, which is television. This is not quite the same thing. And so I think where this boils down to is, and you've said it already, this is a fabulous opportunity, and the advantages are it gets theatre out there. It gives more people the opportunity to see it. The downside of a theatre is you've got to be able to travel to it.
Of course.
And if as I said earlier, I'm not going to be able to make it to South Korea, so I can't get there, but I can see this. But I know that when you do get it on a stage again, and hopefully it'll go to a future Edinburgh Festival Fringe, as you were planning for 2020, and indeed elsewhere, national tours, international tours. Alexander, I'll be there.
All being well.
But I will want to see it live. But for the time being, whilst I cannot see it live, I am desperate to see this video recording.
Oh, well, yes. I mean, in that respect, it's great that we're doing it. It will never totally match the live theatrical experience, but nothing ever can for something that's conceived for theatre.
Quite.
But it does mean that in this time when despite the glut of online shows, theatre fans have felt more than a little deprived, and as you say, it enables people to see it without having to travel anywhere, worry that they're sitting too close to someone who's coughing, spluttering and wheezing, and they can have the theatre brought to them. And I think in that respect, that's definitely a positive to be taken away from the innovations of the last 12 months or so.
But as a creative man, Alexander, I've got to ask you, you're presented with this slightly different world and setup and arrangement for a show intimately. But as the writer, let's put that hat on for you.
Yes.
Did you feel that you needed to tweak any of the material, or did you need to put a line in that acknowledges that actually people are watching this in a slightly different way? Have you said, no, let's take the show and do it, or have you tweaked it slightly for this kind of presentation?
The writing has not been tweaked that much because I'm wary about I think we've seen so many attempts to bring elements of the awfulness that's been going on in the world around us into shows that were conceived before coronavirus was really a thing, and so I didn't want to cheapen the material, for want of a better word, in that way. There is I think a little bit of an awareness in the way it's been staged. I mean, the production is largely based on the Edinburgh incarnation. There is a song that people who saw it in Edinburgh won't have heard before, and it's half of the cast and you, but it's largely based on the Edinburgh incarnation. I think there are a couple of ways in which, staging wise, there is an awareness of what's going on in the wider world. Most notably because, as you may recall, there is a song about doing an on-stage kiss with someone that you can't stand. And so that has been staged in a way that, while simultaneously being meaningful to someone, if there were someone on Earth who had never heard of coronavirus, there probably isn't, but it would still make sense. But it is particularly apt for the times in which we are living. Other than that, because all of us were in a bubble, it didn't really impose too many limitations in terms of staging, other than that we obviously had to adapt to doing it in a new space.
It's interesting because when we spoke previously about this, you did point out the show was originally conceived and indeed first produced as a 2-act show, which meant that there's a lot of songs. And for Edinburgh, you had sort of you've distilled it down to the perfect arc for an Edinburgh slot, which, as you said, is about an hour in popular understanding.
Yes,
this is a different thing again. But presumably because it's a video performance, you wouldn't want an interval. So there must have been some kind of reformatting of it to fit what seems to be the most palatable way of putting a show of this nature on virtually.
Yes, I mean, basically, it is by and large the Edinburgh production. It will be just over an hour in length, so it's not the full production. Having said that, it is a full production, in that I think none of our audiences from Edinburgh, I think if they went away, none of them would have thought, oh, that feels like 2/3 of a show.
Oh, no, not at all. It was perfect.
But, thank you. The reason behind recreating it was just in terms of being realistic about what we could achieve within the time frame and the parameters that we were presented with. For example, partly because it all was quite last minute, it all happened fairly suddenly, partly because we were much more restricted in terms of in-person rehearsal time than we would have been normally, and we were wary of biting off more than we could chew, and it was very much for us a toss-up between doing 65 minutes well, or 90 to 100 minutes where actually we weren't showing off either the material or the talents of our cast or creative team to best effect. And that was really what tipped it towards kind of recreating the Edinburgh incarnation of the show. And I'm glad we did, because it's not an easy sing, it's not an easy learn.
No.
It's, I think some of the songs are deceptively complex. I'm aware of that, and certainly for our cast members who are either new or not done this iteration of the show, it is a big old learn. And we knew that it wasn't one of those projects whereby we'd be able to do multiple performances and cherry pick the best, the best of each. We really just had one opportunity to get it right, and so we wanted to go with the option that would give us the best possible chance of having the highest quality result.
However, I think about an hour and 10 seems about right, because you are getting a bit more than the Edinburgh show, not least because you've got an extra 10 minutes, but also applause and those things which are so lovely in theatre, but obviously we're not going to get in a live performance. But your songs were so good, there was at least a minute's before, so it seemed, a minute or 2 minutes applause after each one.
Oh.
It may not have been that, but accumulating that would take 5 minutes out of a show, 10 minutes out of a show.
Yes.
So what I like is the sound, but this sounds to me like it's going to have the best of the Edinburgh aspects of it, in the sense of the pace, the feel, the arc, the performances. So it's going to be a lovely, rich meal. But it's not going to be a drawn-out meal. You know, an hour and 10 minutes out of anyone's life is a really wonderful timescale. Actually, it's fantastic.
Well, hopefully, and I think certainly with our, with our cast, we were keen to really deliver something that combined some of the Edinburgh lineup, notably our two terrific girls, both Charlotte O'Rourke and Charlotte Ann Steen. Charlotte O'Rourke, many of your listeners would have seen in Mamma Mia in the West End or on tour. Charlotte Ann Steen has been in all kinds of shows, from Bat Out of Hell and 42nd Street in the West End to Rock of Ages and We Will Rock You on tour.
That's quite a range, by the way. Bat Out of Hell and 42nd Street, totally different ends of the spectrum.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I know, you can't get two more diverse shows, but it was, perfect for a show like us, where she really does have to be as versatile as possible. And it was great to get back Lucas Rush, who'd appeared in one of the initial London iterations of the show, who people will know from Rock of Ages or Thoroughly Modern Millie, or his Broadway World Award-nominated performance for American Idiot. But we also wanted to have a completely new element to the cast as well, and we were really chuffed to get Luke Bayer, who is, of course, a What's on Stage award winner for Everybody's Talking About Jamie, and a West End Wilma award winner for Fiver, and all directed and choreographed again by Chris Whitaker, who had worn both hats on the Edinburgh production. So, as you say, it is very much a question of taking some of the elements of the Edinburgh production, a nod to the London iterations that preceded it, and also introducing a completely new element, which will hopefully mean that it speaks to people who've either seen it in Edinburgh or its previous London versions, or haven't seen it at all.
Well, let's get rid of the people who haven't seen it at all, because they now can, and I think it's really essential that we find out and we tell them how they can. So how does someone who wants to see I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical do so?
Well, they go to their nearest computer or phone or internet-enabled device and go to kingsheadtheatre.com. That's kingsheadtheatre.com. Anytime up to and including the 12th of May. And all the information is there. And we are also on Twitter at Like a Musical. The final three words of the title of I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical, at Like a Musical, and they'll be able to find all the details there as well.
And I'll be mentioning them again at the end of the programme. But it's super simple, isn't it? You just basically buy a ticket, and then it's shown on demand between the 22nd of April and the 12th of May. So that is the window to see it.
Yes, you don't have to be available at a specific time or place. You can simply book a ticket and see it whenever and as many times as you like.
Oh, you see, that's even better, because it's one of those shows which is what I call a high-density show. You can get it all in the first viewing, but you get more with a second, or if you know the songs, every time I hear your songs, and I listen to your songs regularly now, Alexander, I always think, oh my word, there's extra layers, or I hadn't spotted that.
Yes, I think specifically in terms of the musical humour, there is a lot of that, as the discerning listener like your good self would have noticed, because although obviously we've touched on the scenarios that are depicted in the songs lyrically and in terms of the characters, I should point out that a lot of those scenarios are reflected comedically in the melodies and the harmonies. So just for example, the opening number is called The Opening Number, and it's all about what it's like for performers to do an opening number while they've got latecomers still trundling in, and while they've got the faces of the audiences in front of them realizing that, oh no, this was a mistake coming to see this show, and all of these other things. But if you listen to the music, which is probably not so noticeable on first listening, although it is an entirely original tune, in actual fact, pretty much every line of music is lifted from an opening number from a well-known show. And I do something similar with the song about dance routines. It's a song called A Step Too Far, and there are quotes aplenty in that, lots of Easter eggs, and I should say in the staging as well. They're all ones that, you know, the people who are not particularly musical theatre savvy, they won't even know they're going over their head. But if you do know your musicals, there'll be a lot of nods of recognition you'll be able to do as you're listening to the tunes take their course.
Basically, if you've got a musical theatre palette, there's all these extra flavours.
Yes. That's the intention. That is the intention.
Now, Alexander, I've said it, and I've said it several times, but I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical is a great show, and I'm looking forward to this, and I'm looking forward to the future. But the future is more for Alexander than just this show. You've got so many other things coming up. So briefly, first of all, what is your, if you're able to tell us, of course, you know, by the end of this year, what are you hoping also to be doing this year? And secondly, how can people stay in touch with you? You know, your website and your Twitter addresses, etc.
All being well, as theatres start to open up, we'll be able to see the plans that were in place for I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical's onward trajectory, both in this country and in other territories. Hopefully, we'll see those be able to come to fruition. All being well, the couple of shows I mentioned, which I'm slightly limited in how much I can say about them, but hopefully they will now be able to be workshopped so that we can be, to use that wonderful phrase, in a room with actors again, and whatever other projects the future may bring. I mean, obviously it's going to be an interesting few weeks and months, and I think everyone is clinging on desperately to the hope that things can open up as they are currently scheduled to be, and that, unlike happened at the end of the last year, they won't open up simply to then swiftly be followed by a general closing down again. So I think anyone who anticipates what exactly is going to transpire over the course of the coming weeks and months does so with an element of rashness, but all being well, there are some exciting things in the pipeline. And in answer to the second part of your question, people can find out more about I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical and the other antics that I'm up to in my professional life, should they so desire, at my website, which is bermange.co.uk, my surname spelt BERMANGE.co.uk, or for the Twitterati amongst the listeners, I'm also on Twitter at Bermange, spelt the same, BERMANGE.
Alexander, thank you so much for this conversation.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, I you know, it's odd, isn't it? Because the first time we met in real life, face to face, in a room that got progressively more crowded, as people who listen to that recording, which we played last week again, can hear. This time, it's quite the reverse. We're entirely virtual. We haven't seen each other. But it just goes to show that wherever there's a will, there's a way. And we've found a great way forward. And so I am absolutely confident that the same will be true of your wonderful show, I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical. Because this virtual performance is, as I say, it's given me such excitement when I heard about it.
Oh, well, thank you.
And I look forward to talking to you again, Alexander, when we're in the next stage of this long transition, when we're back to real life theatre, because I'm desperate to find out more about your other shows and indeed the rest of your career.
Well, it would be lovely to carry on where we left off as soon as circumstances permit.
Alexander, thank you very much and good luck with the show.
Thank you very much. The pleasure was all mine.
I wish that my life were like a musical that's filled with the thrills there should have been. So why do I still put myself through it all? What stops me from just changing scene? It's the faith of a family, each sacrifice they've made.
The belief of the teachers I want to see repaid.
It's the surge of elation each time I get that call.
The rousing power of creation that makes it worth it all.
The fooling and the friendship, the feel of family. It's more than making magic, more like magic's making me.
It's the rush of excitement each time that moment nears.
The escape to a dream world that frees all doubts and fears.
It's the pride of perfecting each detail I prepare.
Those treasured steps across stages that feel like I'm on air.
The source of satisfaction each cheer I hear can be. It's more than making magic, more like magic's making me.
It's the force of the memory that lingers when that's through, and the quest to recapture that distant bliss anew.
It's the sudden surprises tomorrow might reveal. The childhood dreams deep inside me I need to still make real. It's all I love and live for. It's who I have to be. It's more than making magic, more like magic's making me.
Magic's making.
Magic's making me.
Magic's making.
Magic's making me.
Magic's making.
Magic's making.
Magic's making me.
And there we are, another song from I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical by Alexander S. Bermange. And before that, of course, you heard that wonderful in-depth conversation with Alexander about his experiences with that show and in his career since the Edinburgh Festival Fringe of 2019, which now seems such a long time ago. And it's worth reiterating, as though I hadn't done it enough, but it's always worth repeating, that this is a show that everyone's going to be able to see if they want to, because between the 22nd of April and the 12th of May 2021, it will be available for streaming from the King's Head Theatre website. And the address for that is simply kingsheadtheatre, all one word, .com. And just so you know, there's no apostrophe in Kings, and theatre is spelt in the French way, which is to say the English way, Theatre. So that's kingsheadtheatre.com. And it really is a show worth seeing. As I said in that interview, it's almost a show that was designed for listeners of Musical Talk. If you like musical talk, if you like musical theatre, then you'll like I Wish My Life Were Like a Musical. And if you want to find out more about Alexander himself and his career as it goes forward, go to his website, which you can find at bermange.co.uk, Bermange. It's certainly a show I intend to watch again, and I'd be really interested to hear what you think about it. So do give it a whirl. However, I think for the time being, that's probably it for this episode of Musical Talk. It's been a bumper episode, and so there's no point in my extending it beyond its natural limits with diminishing returns, so I don't intend to do that, but I do intend to say that one word which releases us from our mutual listening bonds, and that's this word. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, edited and presented by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2021. Except for the songs, where the copyright remains with Alexander S. Bermange, and my thanks go to him for allowing me to play his wonderful songs in this episode. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos. So let me tell you what I'd like to do if at all possible. And it's exactly the same.
I tell you what.
Yes.
Should we just go for it without your telling me that?
Oh, yes, if you like.
Because then, yeah, I mean, I appreciate your being ready to tell me, but why not go for it? Because then I'll be able to be spontaneous. Do you know what I mean?
I do.
Then I'll be spontaneous.
I'm absolutely happy with that. I have a kind of profile in my head, but then again, I'm always prepared to travel off into various different distances. So the conversation...
It's just otherwise, I know that in answer to the first question, I'll be thinking about what I'll be answering to the one after that. Yeah. So I'm just happy to wing it.
You're a director. I can hear that in your thinking.
Well, I'm not so sure, but...